Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The thinking atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth, not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Podcast, hosted by Seth Andrews.
I wanted to start with something that kind of relates to the topic at hand today, this whole "that's not true Christianity" claim that is everywhere. I'm seeing it all over the place. And it's complicated. I'm going to talk about this in a bit with Dr. Chrissy Stroop, who has written a lot about these claims by some moderate progressive Christians that the bigots and the Christian nationalists, they're not practicing true Christianity. They've betrayed Christianity. They've perverted and distorted Christianity. They've misrepresented the whole religion. Is that true? And of course, the answer is nope. But this morning, and I don't really know why I did it, I decided to go and check some of the reviews of the books that I have written. And I have written 5 of them, and I've narrated all of them. And so I went to audible.com and I just happened to pull up my autobiography, Deconverted. And I clicked on reviews, and there he was. The Christian named Steve. He said, "I'm a Christian with an interest in apologetics. A year or so ago, I started looking into the atheist worldview." Now I have to stop already. Steve, atheism is not a worldview. He said, "I've listened to his podcast and wanted to give his book a read for research purposes." Now, what this tells me is that he was making a list of all the reasons I am full of crap. Steve said, "I'm not impressed at all. He bases his deconversion on poor reasoning and a distorted idea of what Christianity actually is." Oh, I got it wrong again. That's not true Christianity. He said, "While Seth is a gifted narrator, he nonetheless blasphemes the God who made him." The final section asks, "What reaction did this book spark in you?" And Steve said, "The book didn't make me angry, rather sad that Seth didn't have a better Christian foundation before he started questioning his faith. It's easy to fall away from a shallow, superficial version of Christianity. As he says in the beginning, he was never really saved." That's not what I said, Steve. But he says, "I pray God would draw Seth to himself and grant him repentance and faith in Jesus Christ." What I said in the introduction was that Christians look at me, the apostate, the ex-evangelical, and they say there's no way that he would have ever left Christ if he really knew Jesus. So he was never a true Christian to begin with. That's the claim that's made by the apologists. It's not what I said. I never said I was never really saved. I guess let me do a self-serving plug, by the way. You may not know that I have narrated 12 audiobooks, the 5 that I have written. Deconverted was my autobiography. Then Sacred Cows is a lighthearted romp around the world as we examine some of these bizarre human rituals that people still do today. I narrated the Ghost Stories audiobook, Confessions of a Former Fox News Christian, and Christianity Made Me Talk Like an Idiot. That released, I think, 3 years ago. But I've also narrated for other people, other activists and educators out there. Dr. Abby Hafer, The Not So Intelligent Designer. 3 books for Dr. Joshua Bowen, the Assyriologist. Did the Old Testament endorse slavery? And then Volume 1 and 2 of the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. 2 books for Dr. David Madison, former theologian and minister, now heathen. He has the books Guessing About God and 10 Things Christians Wish Jesus Hadn't Taught. A fiction book with secular themes by Lee Bervine called The Kafir Project. And finally, the book by psychologist Dr. Hector Garcia called Alpha God, The Psychology of Religious Violence and Oppression. And he does a great job of exploring why the God of the Bible, the God of the Quran, etc., the gods who were written about by male primates seem to look and think and act like male primates, and how all of this roots to our evolution. It's really a fascinating ride. Anyway, if you're one of those people who likes to listen to audiobooks when you're out and about, that's how you digest your books. I would love the chance to read to you. Just go to audible.com and then type Seth Andrews in your search engine, and all those audiobooks will pop up. Is that 12? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Holy shnikes. 13 audiobooks. Okay. What were we talking about? Oh, yeah. This idea of what is true Christianity. I am surrounded by casual, cultural Christians, so often very good people, but, they're Christians. That's how they identify. I think they're like most homes. Is it an average of 3 Bibles in the American home? I can't remember the statistic, but we live in a culture where people own Bibles, but they don't ever read them. And they certainly don't know what's in them. So if they need education on the Bible, they often have to ask the atheist, because we're usually, statistically, in fact, we are more Bible literate than the vast majority of Bible believers. But the Christians that I'm surrounded with, they go to church, they have the Christian t-shirt, maybe listen to some Christian music, but their Jesus is just love and light. Goodness, charity, compassion. It's this hippie Jesus. You can just picture him in your mind. He's got the long white robe and his hands are outstretched, and there's the soundtrack of a Pure Flix movie playing in the background. And he says, "Come to me, my children. I will shower you with my unconditional divine love and protections." And that means all of you, every single one of you, including the same people that Yahweh kicked the shit out of throughout the Old Testament. 39 Bible books of smiting. Just all kinds of smiting going on. So sure, you've got the New Testament, which is a softer sell. 260 chapters of supposed love and light. It's easier to swallow, but you still have to set that against the 900 plus chapters of the Old Testament, where God gleefully breathes in the aroma of burning human flesh. And this is the same God as Jesus. At the triune God, the Holy Trinity, there's Yahweh, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. And that's always fun to watch the apologists explain this. Well, they're 1 and 3 and 3 and 1. They are absolutely unique and different while being exactly the same. That's always fun to listen to. But what we can take from that is that Yahweh and Jesus are the same deity. The Father is the Son is the Father. Somehow they're the one. It's freaky, but that's how they pitch it. So Jesus is not off the hook. Jesus is there in the war room, as most of the Bible is about dominionism and conquest against the same people that these moderate Christians today keep telling us Jesus loves unconditionally. What is Christian nationalism? It's a declaration that everything belongs to God, and that's rooted in Scripture. Psalm 24, "The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." And we see God claiming his property at the end of a sword throughout most of the Bible. You got the conquest of Bashan. That's the book of Numbers. What is that? 60 cities. God's army goes in. They just crush everybody. They destroy and exterminate the population of 60 cities. Those are now Yahweh's cities. God is love. The Israelites are conquering the Midianites. They kill everybody, and then they divide all the plunder. That belongs to God. The lands of Canaan, those belong to God. So this loving deity smashes his way into Jericho, the city of Ai, Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron. God's army is cutting off the heads of kings and shipping them out. Murdering pregnant women and raping the virgins that they kidnap, right? The biblical God of the Old Testament. How could somebody who owns one of those Bibles and reads those verses say that that is not true Christianity? Now, if we see a religion as an expression, and you have moderated out a lot of the hate and death and murder and pain and all that stuff, and you've got a different version, maybe for you, that's true Christianity, but you don't get to conveniently just whitewash the millions of corpses that Yahweh left in his wake because he was not a God of love, but instead was a God of jealousy and rage and dominion. You can see the rift in the church, even and often especially in certain denominations, over which interpretation of the Bible is true Christianity. The hardliners see the anti-gay verses. God's executing the homosexual because he or she is an abomination unto God. And their sermons resonate today. God wanted gays dead then. God probably wants gays dead today. And they've got chapter and verse that they can cite. And then I've got all of these progressives who are saying, my Jesus would never judge gay people. John Pavlovitz, you're killing me. Pastor Pavlovitz continues to assert that Jesus never condemned LGBT people. But Jesus and Yahweh are exactly the same deity. Hebrews says Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever, unchanging, including attitudes about non-heterosexuals. And then you've got Jesus's man, Paul, the beloved and admired apostle Paul. He's writing in the book of Romans, chapter 1, and he's speaking specifically about gay people, talking about how God gave them over to the sinful desires in their hearts regarding sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. Verse 26, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. In fact, if you bounce down to the bottom of chapter 1 of Romans, it talks about how they deserve death. Now, whether you see this as a physical death on earth or eternal death in hell, it's still punishment. It is still condemned. It is still a negative. And Paul is a representative of, an ambassador for, a bullhorn for the message of Jesus Christ himself. It could be argued that he's the most important apostle because it is believed that Paul was the author of 13 New Testament books. Well, you can't just write that off and say, well, Jesus loves everybody and would never condemn gay people, because his number one, the right-hand man, Paul, is out there condemning gay people. And in some ways, it's become comical. Over here, you've got these often lovely people who have opened their arms and their homes and their buildings and their cultures and their churches to everybody. We are not interested in judgment because our Jesus does not judge. He's a God of love. So there's a place for you. Many churches now are bringing in LGBT clergy. Take the pulpit, stand on stage, share your expertise, your perspective, your humanity. That's true Christianity. That's what Jesus was about, love and light and acceptance and goodness. And over here, the Bible literalists are about to have a heart attack. Well, that's not true Christianity. You guys are practicing a false faith. Bunch of wishy-washy, mamby-pamby, permissive types. You are mingling with the unwashed. If you call yourself a Christian, but you participate in this sexual deviance, well, I say this in love, but you're going to burn in fires so hot that God's going to have to install special filters in the clouds to keep the rising stench of your burning flesh from stinking up paradise. Oh, yeah. I don't know why the drawl kicks in when I start to do the preacher thing. Well, maybe I do, actually. Because now I come from 31 flavors of Christianity. Dad was an ex-Lutheran. Mom was Pentecostal. I went to a Baptist school. We attended Baptist churches, Assembly of God churches, and hardcore Pentecostal. In fact, when I was in junior high, we went to this one little Pentecostal church in a suburb of Tulsa. The pastor's name is Billy Wheeler. And he was like a lot of pastors that we heard when I was growing up. And the more passionate they got, the more they would start to do that Josh Feuerstein voice. You know, that typical pastor voice, the John Hagee voice. Oh, the Lord came down to me in a vision, in a dream, and he told me, Billy Wheeler, you need to go forth and spread my word. They all do that, or most of them. You don't hear quite as much of it these days. Maybe the Joel Osteens are doing their own riff on it, but I just sort of slip into that. It amuses me. Anyway, the Pentecostal preacher disagrees with the Baptist preacher, disagrees with the Assembly of God preacher, disagrees with the Lutheran preacher, disagrees with the Catholic priest. I think I've told the story about Bishop Carlton Pearson. We could call him a mega pastor. He had a massive church here in town called Higher Dimensions. He was the real thing. He was on television and he was a household name in Christian circles. All of a sudden, he came to a realization that no moral God would have ever created hell. He just thought that this makes no sense. It makes no moral sense. It doesn't make sense in the context of any of Jesus's greatest teachings. I don't buy it. And so he tells his church, I've had an epiphany here. I think hell does not exist. And you should have seen the churches who were the same denomination. They turned on him and they shut his career down and destroyed his reputation. He lost his church and spent most of the rest of his life on the fringes of Christian society. He insisted he was a true Christian. His critics insisted he was not. You could make this a game show. Just call it True Christianity ? And invite a whole bunch of people, not even apologists, everyday mainstream Christians, contemporary Christians. Toss them in a big auditorium and ask them some basic questions and allow them to ask questions of each other. And you can start by taking the Baptist and put them all in a section over here. Okay, just put the Baptist and just ask them, okay, what's true Christianity? Is it the Southern Baptist Church, the Independent, the New Independents, the Free Will Baptist, some other form of the Baptist Church? And they start to squabble and point and freak out. And then you have them give an opinion about the Pentecostals, the Assemblies of God, the Gideons, the Lutherans, the Episcopals, and then they weigh in on each other and the noise level goes up. And before you know it, it's Thunderdome. Then you try to get calm. You bring everybody back down to an even keel and you ask the next question. What's the proper translation of the Bible if you're going to practice true Christianity? Well, the old school hardliners jump in and say, the King James Bible. How can you even ask the question? Of course, it's the KJV. And somebody else says, no, it's the New King James Bible. No, it's the Christian Standard, the CSB, the English Standard Version, the New American Standard, Revised Standard, New Revised Standard, the New Living Translation, the NIV, the New International Version. No, it's the New International Reader's Version, which is the NIRV, the Message Bible with concordance. It's awesome to watch these people using the word revised to describe a book that's supposed to be absolutely inerrant and the unchangeable truth. This is an authoritative word from God. It is without error. Revised. It's just awesome. These followers of the God who is not the author of confusion, how much time do they spend accusing other Christians of being confused? I stumbled upon a piece that was published on CNN. This was aired first in 2023 from John Avlon's show. It's called Reality Check. And he was talking about how Christian nationalism is not Christianity. And already I'm starting to set my jaw, right? But he had Amanda Tyler on. She's with the Baptist Joint Committee. She is founder of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Amanda's a friend. I've had her on this show. I love her. I think she is a great ally in the fight for state-church separation. We work together to that end, believing there's a place for all of us. I appreciate the egalitarian version of the faith that she practices. But it's so frustrating to listen to Christians distance themselves from the fundamentals of their faith. Here's a clip.
Christian nationalism is not Christianity. Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework that tries to merge our identities as Americans and in Christians. And in the process, it threatens Americans' democracy. It distorts America's promise of religious freedom for all. And importantly to me and to thousands of other Christians, it distorts Christianity, sometimes beyond recognition. And that's because it takes Christianity's central message, which is a gospel of love, and turns it into a false idol of power.
Is that really true? Do the egalitarian, loving, kind, compassionate, open-hearted Christians get to simply look at the dominionists, the Christian nationalists, the people who are living in a culture of God-excused cruelty and just write them off and say, well, they got it wrong because that's not our faith. It's not an accurate representation. I want to talk about this with Dr. Chrissy Stroop. She is a friend of mine who is an ex-evangelical and activist, has done a lot of writing about Christian nationalism and the rising fervor out there to essentially turn us into Gilead. We'll have her take on true Christianity next. Before we continue, next up on my speaking roster, I'm going to Los Angeles, California, May the 19th. I've been invited by the Center for Inquiry West. And so mark your calendar for that. And then the Secular Student Alliance Conference in June. I'll be in Denver, June 29th, St. Louis in July, Dallas, Houston, some others. All the details with links, sethandrews.com/events. I want to speak to somebody who has a lot of commentary written out there, published out there about the Christian right, about evangelicals on the move in this country, and about alliances with religious people. Dr. Chrissy Stroop. By the way, what's your doctorate in? You studied in Russia, right, as I recall?
I did study the Russian language in Russia, and then after I graduated with my PhD, I taught at a Russian university for a while in Moscow, the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration, or RANIPA. It sounds even better in Russian. Российская академия народного хозяйства и государственной службы при президенте Российской Федерации. Wow. That's why the Soviets and now the Russians, love acronyms so much. But,
must be fun to say Russia in today's climate with Ukraine going on and Putin out of control. And does everybody go, what in the hell? Why would you ever go there? Do you ever hear that when people ask?
Yes. And back in the sort of heady days of 2016 and 2017 on Twitter, when Louise Mensch was a thing, and she was for a time sort of a darling of American liberals because she was an anti-Trump conservative. She and some of her minions, I would call them, her online hangers-on, accused me of being a Russian spy, whereas they actually have no background in this field whatsoever.
It's interesting to watch the right-wing worship of strong men, or what they see as strong men. We've seen it with Trump, and they see it with Putin. Putin kicks ass. He takes what he wants, big man kind of thing. It's weird watching these, Jesus followers who then flip and go, but God also kicked ass and took what he wanted. They seem to admire Putin. It's terrifying.
Yeah, I saw the admiration for Putin. It's certainly not universal among conservative evangelicals. I mean, for some, there has to be some ambivalence now with the war in particular.
God and Country, the new documentary produced by Rob Reiner. It's really well produced. I mean, from a technical point of view, from a storytelling point of view, it has a lot of Christians on camera, many of whom I have had on my show. Dr. Kristen Dumais, Andrew Whitehead, I think someone, I'm trying to remember. But whenever I have spoken to them and they say, well, these people over here, the Christian nationalists, they are idolaters. They distorted Christianity because Jesus is only goodness and Jesus would never judge and Jesus doesn't need a state church. I asked them this question. I say, in the Bible, God gave Adam dominion over the earth. The entire Old Testament is nothing but tribal wars, dominionist wars for land and resources. And at the end of the whole biblical story, the non-compliant get annihilated. If you read the Bible, Christianity is a dominionist religion. And when I have mentioned this to my Christian interlocutors, they kind of blink at me and say, well, these are challenges. These are lively discussions that we in the church have been having. And, these are things that sometimes we don't always have the answers to, but they remain good questions. And that's all I get. I've never gotten a good answer.
I follow that closely because, it kind of bothers me to no end. And the way I look at it, I don't want to deny that progressive, inclusive, liberationist forms of Christianity are really Christianity. I would just like those people to understand and admit that they are not the only forms of Christianity. And I get that sometimes they may want to have internal debates with other Christians. I don't think that a movie aimed at general audiences is a good forum or venue for that, especially when we don't get the context that that is what is happening. We have so many people in God and Country stating that Christian nationalism, it's just politics, it's idolatry. Well, look, things like idolatry, heresy, they are categories that only make sense from an internal Christian perspective, within an internal Christian framework. And Christianity, like any religion, is a complicated cultural system, to borrow a phrase from the anthropologist Clifford Geertz that I think works really nicely. Religions are cultural systems, right? So a cultural system is big enough to contain internal tensions, contradictions, contestation. I think the problem with sort of the national conversation about Christianity and politics in the United States is that editorial choices are being used to make theological arguments without telling readers or viewers that that's what they are doing. And so we then end up with a theological perspective on Christianity in the public sphere rather than a historical, anthropological, sociological perspective in which we have to say, look, they're all Christians, okay? And they disagree with each other. And these ones actually support human rights, and that's great. And these ones don't, and these ones have more power, and we need to be aware of that. And it isn't helpful in doing that to make the theological move of dismissing the fundamentalists and the bigots from Christianity. And it's also just completely ahistorical and empirically wrong. I mean, they represent what Christianity has mostly been. It has mostly been in bed with imperial power and colonization and dominion and conquests and authoritarian rule since at least the 4th century. And people will say, oh, well, okay, but that was Constantine and that was St. Augustine maybe making some compromises. And okay, you know what? It's also very much there in Paul. And before you say, yes, but not Jesus, it's in Jesus too, right? Like the impulse is to do this thing. This idea that you are working towards the kingdom of God and ultimately sort of apocalyptic violence to bring it into being, it's all there in the texts. Every knee shall bow, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, right? That's a prediction about the future. And the people who don't do that willingly will go to hell and be burned forever, which is an invention of the New Testament, right? And in Jewish practice and in the Hebrew scriptures, you don't have hell. And yeah, you do have those narratives of conquest and genocide, but you also have some really humane things like provisions among the ancient Israelites for taking care of the poor, for debt forgiveness, for that sort of thing. So this whole sort of Old Testament bad, New Testament good narrative that a lot of people like to throw around also doesn't hold water, and also doesn't really work for any kind of Christian, because they still have to be sort of saying that they're building on Judaism, right? Even if some of them don't want to say they supersede it, because supersessionism, of course, is very anti-Semitic theology, which is the idea that, Christianity not just grew out of Judaism, but replaced it.
Dr. Robert P. Jones wrote a book about the hidden roots of white supremacy in Christian nationalism. You want to speak to that?
Sure. I respect Robert Jones and PRRI. They do a lot of really important research on religion and politics in the United States. And he's absolutely right that you can't understand American conservative Christianity without understanding that it's very much based in racism and slavery. And obviously, this is something that more recently, a lot of white evangelicals who want more respectability have sort of tried to erase or cover up, or they'll say, well, look, we're the same evangelicals as those ones who were abolitionists back in the day, which is not true at all. I mean, the contemporary American evangelical church is much more a product of slaveholder Christianity from the antebellum South than it is anything that has anything to do with the Second Great Awakening. But you hear a lot of evangelicals say, no, evangelicals were historically abolitionists. Yeah, some of them were, but not really the ones who had much influence on where we are today. And even those ones were by and large racist. Like Abraham Lincoln, they didn't think a black man could be the equal of a white man. And even evangelical institutions founded by abolitionists like Wheaton College in Illinois, which incidentally is where a lot of major commentators on evangelicals come from. Michael Gerson and Sarah Pulliam Bailey at the Washington Post and Elizabeth Diaz at the New York Times, they're graduates of Wheaton. I think that's important to know. Now, Wheaton likes to point out that they were founded by abolitionists, but Wheaton has only ever had one tenured African-American woman, and maybe only one tenured African-American person, I'm not sure, but certainly only one tenured African-American woman in their entire history as a college. And they recently fired her, even though she was tenured, because she expressed solidarity with Muslims. So there are forms of American Christianity that resist this, obviously, the Black church, right, which also has its roots in the antebellum South and in slavery and in resistance to slavery and white racism. But white American Christianity, you just can't extricate it from the history and present realities of racism in the United States.
I'm watching God and Country, and I need your counsel because I'm watching it and I'm trying to see maybe a moderate Christian, I don't know, somebody who is fluctuating. Maybe they voted for Trump once, but they're genuinely grieved and they're not educated about state-church separation. Maybe they're not aware of the consequences. And so they go, fine, I'll watch the documentary. And I can see how it might be compelling and perhaps even move them away from extremism, away from Gilead. And I think that's a good thing. But is that the tool in the toolbox we should be using? Is it problematic?
Well, I don't think it's the right kind of tool necessarily to do that. Maybe for the sake of argument, we can admit there might be a very tiny handful of people out there who might watch this and think, oh yeah, because Phil Vischer and David French and Russell Moore told me not to be a Christian nationalist, I just won't vote for president in 2024. They're not going to vote Democrats, let's be honest. And I don't think that you can really reach people at scale that way. And here's the thing. These hardcore Trump-supporting Christian nationalists, they do go to church. They go to churches, for the most part, that are probably incubating their Trump support and telling them to vote Trump or vote Republicans. And they're consuming stuff online, probably being told in church as well, that, oh, that Russell Moore, he's a totally woke sellout now. David French, woke sellout. We don't need to pay attention to these people. So I think they're not going to reach them. And I think that any benefit that might come from this tiny number of people that might be reached in this way, and I do think it seems pretty clear that must be a goal of the filmmakers. I think it's a naive goal, if a noble one. But yeah, I think any good that might be done by that is going to be outweighed by the way the film just whitewashes Christianity and even evangelicalism by letting the not all evangelicals people who are indeed partly responsible for creating this monster, but now they want to distance themselves from it, by simply letting them do that without providing any context on things like how Russell Moore, who for a long time was a bigwig in the Southern Baptist denomination, now he's editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, and He left the Southern Baptist Convention amid fallout over child sex abuse scandals, and he was someone who was very much supporting abuse survivors. That's good, right? He certainly has some humane impulses. This is why they see him as too woke, though. I mean, it's a big part of it. But he's still very much a supporter of what he used to call biblical patriarchy. Now they call complementarianism. He's still a man who has called feminism a heresy and a problem in the church. And I don't think he's ever disavowed those comments, even though they were made some years ago. He hasn't changed his view on gender hierarchy. He just wants to do it in a kinder, gentler way. And that's always going to lead to abuse. So they're whitewashing these people's reputations. They're eliding all the lines between people like Russell Moore and David French, who are still far right-wing conservative Christians who do harm, whose theology is harmful to women, queer people, minorities. They're eliding all the differences between them and then the people like Bishop William Barber and Kristen Kobes-Dumé and others who are more inclusive. And I think that if this film had been done with more context to distinguish between those people and had included more voices, I'm not saying don't include any Never Trump evangelicals, but just include some more robust critics of evangelicalism as well, some well-informed ex-evangelicals, for example, or let someone who's just known on the atheist circuit, like you've already got Seidel in the film, let him say some things about Christianity and not just about how the Christian nationalist vision is totally bonkers when you actually look at the founding history and the historical documents that we have from that time. But they clearly wanted to sell a certain narrative. And I think one of the goals for that narrative is, yes, they think that they're actually going to convince some evangelicals to leave the Christian nationalism behind. I just don't think that's going to happen. And I don't think if a few people do it, it's worth the cost of just reinforcing Christian privilege, which is exactly what gives Christian nationalists so much cover and power and prestige in the first place. We've got to dismantle Christian privilege in this country. And you can keep some of those voices in there. You can keep that narrative as a part of it, but don't make it your overarching narrative. Bring in more voices. Bring in some critics who can say, look, okay, Russell Moore's saying some nice stuff now, but look, he's still very anti-woman. And look what he did in the past. There's none of that. And if you include that, I think you have a good film.
You've mentioned David French, opinion columnist for the New York Times, a few times here. What's the deal with French? He was included as an enemy of Christian nationalism, and he was lined up with all these other much more moderate, progressive, egalitarian minister types. But he's problematic. Why?
Well, because he has basically the same theology as pro-Trump evangelicals, and he's been an important figure in the conservative movement for a long time. So you can say, not as much as Russell Moore, but you can say that David French also helped to create the problem that now he's sort of attacking, but without wanting to revise his views on, say, queer people at all. He's also derided by your mainstream evangelicals these days as woke. So he's absolutely not going to reach them. They already consider him one of the bad guys. He's not the only one whose reputation is being whitewashed this way in the film. I just think he's probably the best known one, certainly to people who didn't grow up evangelical. He would have the widest name recognition. But look, there's also Rob Schenck, who was a hardline lobbyist for Christian right issues for such a long time. And he's the one who kind of like breaks down crying, realizing that one of the big theologians that he studied in grad school was a Nazi who wrote theology to justify the Nazi project. And he was never told that. Then he turns around and kind of says that he doesn't even want to call Christian nationalism evangelicalism anymore, even though he's just given us the perfect example of how they're compatible, right? Evangelicals literally teach Nazi theologians in their seminaries. But so, he's there, Russell Moore's there, people with less name recognition, Phil Vischer, Skye Jethani. There's a lot of conservative Christians in this film who are able to whitewash their own reputations, and just the film totally ignores that they still want to ban abortion. They still don't want queer people to have rights, or at least they're iffy on that.
But God and Country is the kind of documentary that I might consider, if I had an opportunity and if they expressed genuine interest, might expose my religious friends and family to. It's almost like a gateway film. And now you've got me thinking, is that dishonest because they misrepresent what Christian nationalists are, which is a form of true Christianity? But I see it resonating, at least emotionally, with them, as they're like, wait a minute. The humanity of these people rejects hate and bigotry, at least on the surface. The messaging is this. Plus, they hear the state-church separation stuff from a constitutional attorney, blah, blah, blah. Part of me wonders if it might serve as a kind of gateway film to the discussion. Am I just childish? Because I can be very reductive. What do you think?
No, I'm not going to say you're being childish in that
Come
respect.
on, tell me I'm childish. Just let me have it. Let me have it.
I'd be a hypocrite if I did, because I've actually had the thought myself that since this film exists as it does, I might recommend it to, for example, my mom. But now, if this film might be able to reach a few people and help them rethink a few things, I still say the rest of my criticism of the film stands. And I don't think that a film like this is going to reach people at scale. I think in the context of, okay, I have a pre-standing relationship with this person. Our relationship is not based only on our differences about Christianity and politics. It's based on a lot of other things, like this person raised me, or we grew up together. We have shared memories. We have shared hobbies. If you have a relationship like that with someone, that is the kind of situation in which maybe over time with patience, you might be able to sway them on some things that have been important to their identity, but that are harmful to other people or even to themselves. But, when something is a part of a person's core identity, it's very hard for that to change. And typically it doesn't change with intellectual arguments. There are very few people who are going to be argued out of positions that are things that really matter to them at the core of their identity. But if you can bypass the emotional defenses by reaching them on a human level because of some other relationship you have, then maybe occasionally some people like that are going to change. I think a lot of evangelicals are never going to be reached. And I don't think a movie like this reaches people at scale, but it might be a tool for those of us who could reach people on a micro scale.
Even with Rob Reiner's name attached, a big A-list Hollywood guy.
I don't think his name necessarily does much one way or another with evangelicals.
Okay, so how do we balance the Christianity-humanity equation? I continue with my guest, Dr. Chrissy Stroop, next. We're talking about true Christianity on today's broadcast. I'm speaking here with my guest, Dr. Chrissy Stroop. I am always pounding this drum, that there are lovely, wonderful Christians in this world. I'm so sick and tired of people saying that all Christians are. There's 4 billion of them on the planet. And I just think about the wide, wild spectrum of humanity. And I think for me, it just comes down to humanity. You'll find this and that and everything in between. And you have been much more, not even charitable. I think you've been just more real and honest about the humanity of many religious people who are lovely people. I'll just toss you that ball and you can do what you want with it, okay?
Yeah. As anyone who's read much of my work will be aware, I advocate pluralism pretty often as sort of essential to democracy. And I tend to do that sometimes when I'm giving talks or that sort of thing too. I remember giving a talk to one atheist organization once, and someone in the audience said, "Are we losing the war with organized religion?" Was one of the questions in the Q&A. And I said, well, if you're fighting a war with organized religion, then yeah, you're losing it, but I'm not fighting a war with organized religion, right? Because I don't think that's what secular advocacy should be. I think secular advocacy should be organized around values, certainly around separation of state and religion, right? That's critically important. But there are religious people who embrace that as well. And in many cases, I think we can work with them, and it's better and more helpful to do secular advocacy in ways that sort of affect real people and aren't just sort of philosophical and semantic debates. So I think atheism is political. Secularism is political. Religion's political. Everything's political. So let's not pretend that we're just sort of high and mighty and above it all. And let's not just stick in the realm of abstract debate all the time. But let's build coalitions around shared values to do things that secular people and inclusive religious people of good faith, pun intended, I guess, can agree on. We can work together in a lot of areas. And so we don't have to condemn religion writ large or Christianity writ large or Islam writ large. We can see people as people. We can see there are differences between different religious groups. At the same time, we can definitely oppose any sort of theocracy. And I think we do that more effectively by embracing the inevitable pluralism of a modern society. And I think embracing pluralism is good for democracy.
How about, I think if I was to phrase it, though, it would be the right of someone to be true to themselves and take their own journey. But the religions themselves, if they're demonstrably wrong and often destructive, then promoting them or celebrating them in any way, I mean, I don't see that as pluralistic democracy and inclusion as much as enabling horrible ideas. The dogmas get no quarter from me. So you're not saying that we pat everybody on the head and say, okay, you believe in Adam and Eve and Samson.
No, and I kind of think that's what God and country did, to be honest, was pat them on the head.
Okay. Well, I mean, I like the idea. Like, you have a right to believe, but that right ends at the tip of my nose kind of a deal. It's a bit reductive, but I do like that.
I'm very opposed to proselytizing. And I mean, I talk about working together. I think a lot of times we can put certain differences aside. And maybe for me, I'll countenance more theological arguments, theological language than maybe some people would. And I think that can also be okay.
Well, if I can jump in, though, quickly, this is one of the reasons that I ally with Americans United for separation of church and state. Rachel Lazar is a practicing Jew, and she believes in God, but we align in values, and I want her on our side.
Yeah, I think rejecting that is, and saying that anyone who believes in God can't do anything good, is extremely counterproductive and reductive and just inaccurate.
Kind of snobby.
And I don't even
really
snobby. Yeah, I don't even see believing in God and doing lots of good things as in any way contradictory. Look, belief or non-belief in God may be a personal thing. It's not something that we can prove one way or another. I'm always going to be solidly in the agnostic atheist corner because I don't think God exists, right? I haven't, like Carl Sagan used to say, look, I've not been shown any compelling evidence that God exists, so I'll operate from the hypothesis that God doesn't until I should see some evidence like that, right? But it's not something that can be proven one way or another by science. It's just God's not an empirical thing. And I don't love it, but I don't have a problem with it. And then there's also the whole issue of how in some religions you can also not believe in God, but you can still be a practicing member of the religion because it's really about community and values.
Certain gods have been debunked. I mean, we say God in the nebulous watchmaker, first cause, deistic way, whatever. Something's out there floating. But if we look at specific religious claims, we can see, well, that God is fiction. That God is mythology. That God was borrowed from another religion who made up their God. So in that context, we can say it's knowable because this specific deity with a proper name, we know that's bullshit. That's fair, right?
I mean, all right, okay. And certainly, like, look, if
I'm not trying to be pedantic.
No, I get it.
Okay.
I get it. These are actually, I think these are important conversations for those of us in the atheist and secular community to have. I mean, certainly you can easily debunk the claims of Mormonism, right? Because this was a religion that's invented out of whole cloth in modern times. But is there much point in doing that unless you're trying to sort of help people who are questioning their Mormon faith? I mean, for me, just belaboring everything that's wrong with the LDS Church would be sort of beside the point. If I want to work with some LDS person who is pro-LGBTQ and wants the church to change its stance on certain things. But again, I think atheists tend to overstate the importance of belief. And it is very important in Protestantism, for the most part, in Protestant Christianity. I think that's where we get this intense focus on belief versus unbelief. Whereas a lot of what religion does is really more about bringing people together in community to navigate values. And yes, some religions put more emphasis on the false beliefs than others, or in some cases demonstrably false, in some cases, let's say, unfalsifiable. Let's be a little nicer to it. But of course, there's no reason to believe in something that's unfalsifiable.
When I look at religions, I boil it down to, in my experience, 5 determiners for why someone was or is religious and why they stay. It's geography, family, ritual, community, and comfort. It's hardly ever theology. And I think understanding the community power, the family power, the support structure, often used insidiously, I think, by some religions, but understanding why people connect. We're a tribal, we're a communal creature, that kind of thing. I appreciate your compassionate approach to religious people. I think it's refreshing and certainly necessary. And then once we share humanity, then I think we can have the coffee table discussion about whether or not a donkey could speak Hebrew in the book of Genesis.
But I think, you'll find very few Christians who believe that, and even fewer Jews. So, well, okay, you'll find a lot of Christians actually, but still, I'm not sure a majority. But well, anyway.
But it's in their Bible. It bugs me. It's there. It bugs. All right, now, we can go all night. I'm going to link to the review of God and Country that you wrote in the description box so that everybody can go back. And you just did you just combed through the film. And so I'm going to put that link in the description box. And let's try to rendezvous again maybe later in the year, and we'll kind of see what happens as we ramp up toward the election.
Yeah, always happy to talk with you, Seth. And
all right, you're amazing.
If you wouldn't mind, let me just say, too, that back in August, I launched a new Substack newsletter. So it's called The Bugbear Dispatch, and I'd love for people to follow me there.
I will link that as well. So everything's in the description box. Dr. Chrissy Stroop, you were just so smart. I just want to get smarter by osmosis. I'll never speak Russian.
Well,
like that.
You're obviously very smart yourself, and I don't think speaking Russian is the measure of intelligence. It may have been an unintelligent choice to study it, and it's not very useful these days.
It's certainly a stigmatized choice at this point in our history. Chrissy, we'll talk again. Be safe out there, and thanks.
Thank you, Seth.
I guess this may be one of those situations where we see it as not a binary answer, right? It doesn't fit in a cookie cutter. We can understand the history and even the utility of religions, creating a support structure, culture, community, family. So we understand that, it may have played a certain vital role, and non-dogmatic religions might in some way, certainly secular religions, they're not harming anybody. And in fact, they might sometimes help other people. But these churches can also be dogmatic and wrong, teaching bad science, bad history, bad morality. I remember in my own life, I was trained, no matter how much we knew our Bible or didn't know, we were trained to distrust science and scientists. We embraced our own lack of worth and had to get our worth from God. We struggled with the idea of going to hell and burning forever. I remember saying the salvation prayer over and over as a kid to keep myself from burning for eternity. So we can't say that stuff is not there. It's not prevalent, even mainstream, certainly harmful. What's that line by Ingersoll? I love this quote. The more false we destroy, the more room there will be for the true. So can we understand and even sometimes align with religious cultures while still acknowledging that much of it is not true and challenging those untruths in our discussions out there? I will leave this discussion to you in the comments section as you debate true Christianity. Thanks for listening. I'll see you back here next week.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter for a complete archive of podcasts and videos, products like mugs and t-shirts featuring the Thinking Atheist logo, links to atheist pages and resources, and details on upcoming free thought events and conventions. Log on to our website, thethinkingatheist.com.